In September 2024, 22-year-old Mara Voss stood in the dust of Lea County, New Mexico, watching 6 honey badgers tear apart the only corner of her farm she could no longer afford to lose. The cotton was failing. Her irrigation bill was overdue. The bank had given her 28 days to find $46,800. And every night, those animals returned to the same patch of ground behind the equipment shed and dug until their claws disappeared into the dirt. Mara had already been laughed at twice for saying something was wrong there. She didn't know what it was. She only knew the animals wouldn't leave it alone. The farm had belonged to Mara's grandfather, Lea Voss, who had raised cotton on the property for nearly 40 years. When he died, Mara inherited 118 acres, an old Ford 8N tractor, a rusted cotton trailer, a failing irrigation system, and enough debt to make the inheritance feel less like a gift than a sentence. She had stayed anyway. Every morning began before sunrise. She checked the irrigation lines, walked the cotton rows, cleared weeds around the pump, greased the Ford. Then she worked until the desert heat drove her into the shade. There were no dramatic plans, no investors, no secret savings, just work. The honey badgers were supposed to be temporary. A wildlife facility in western Texas had lost funding, and 6 animals needed somewhere safe until permanent placements could be arranged. Mara had an unused livestock enclosure, so she agreed. She regretted it by the end of the first week. The animals dug constantly. They overturned rocks, destroyed fence posts, opened holes beneath wooden barriers. But one corner was different. They weren't simply digging there. They were returning there. Every night. Always after sunset. Always along the northern edge of the enclosure. Mara first noticed the pattern on August 31st. She had been repairing a broken irrigation valve when she heard scratching behind her. She turned. One honey badger was digging. Another stood behind it. 3 more were sniffing the dirt. The 6th watched from several feet away. Mara leaned against the fence. "What's down there?" The animals ignored her. By midnight, the hole was almost 2 feet deep. The next morning, Mara filled it. That night, they dug it again. The second time, she left it alone. The animals dug deeper. By the 7th night, they had removed nearly 3 feet of soil. That was when Mara noticed the smell. It wasn't strong. It wasn't even obvious. But when she knelt beside the hole, she caught something beneath the smell of dry earth. Diesel. Old machinery. Something oily. She rubbed a little soil between her fingers. The dirt was darker at the bottom. Mara looked toward the animals. One of them had stopped digging. It stared directly at her. Then it lowered its nose into the hole. Mara stood. The next morning she called Everett Cole. Everett was 62 and had spent most of his working life repairing oil field pumps around Lea County. He had also known Lea Voss for more than 30 years. He arrived in a dusty pickup, walked to the hole, and laughed. "You've finally lost it, girl?" Mara folded her arms. "The animals keep digging here." "That's what animals do. Not like this." Everett crouched. He scooped a handful of soil, rolled it between his fingers, then smelled it. His smile faded. "What?" He looked at her. "You smell that?" "Yes." Everett stood slowly. "Could be nothing. But—" He looked toward the north field. "There used to be drilling around here." Mara frowned. "How much drilling?" "Enough." She waited. Everett didn't elaborate. That irritated her. "What aren't you telling me?" He glanced toward the old equipment shed. "Your grandfather never liked talking about the north boundary." Mara had never heard that. "Why?" Everett shrugged. Because Elias didn't like admitting when something beat him. That night, Mara went through her grandfather's old records, seed invoices, tractor receipt, property taxes, irrigation map, weather journals. At the bottom of a cabinet, she found a folded geological map. The paper was yellow. A date had been written in blue ink. April 1972. There was a red circle near the northern boundary. Beside it were two words, dry hole. Mara stared at them. Then she unfolded the map completely. The red circle was only a few hundred yards from the honey badgers. She called Everett. He didn't answer. She called again. Nothing. Mara walked outside. The animals were digging again. She approached the fence. Was there a well here? Everett finally called back. Yes. Mara's stomach tightened. Where? I told you. Near the north boundary. How close? Silence. Everett. 400 yards, maybe less. Mara looked toward the dark field. Why is there no well there now? It was abandoned. Why? Dry. She looked at the hole. Then why does the soil smell like oil? Everett didn't answer. At 1:17 in the morning, Mara heard the animals scratching again. She walked outside with a flashlight. 5 honey badgers were asleep. The smallest female was alone. She was digging. Mara approached. The animal stopped. Its head lifted. Then the ground beneath its front claws made a tiny popping sound. Mara froze. A bubble appeared in the soil. Then another. She crouched. A black bead pushed through the dirt. It glistened in the flashlight beam. Mara didn't touch it. She didn't breathe. The bead slowly rolled down the side of the hole, then disappeared beneath the soil. Mara stared at the place where it had vanished. The ground made another soft hiss, and this time the smell was unmistakable. Oil. Mara called Everett again. He arrived before sunrise. He didn't laugh. He didn't even speak at first. He knelt beside the hole and shined a flashlight into the bottom. The soil was blacker than it had been the night before. Everett touched it with a wooden stick. The smell reached them immediately. Don't touch it with your hands, he said. Mara stepped back. Is it oil? Petroleum. Same thing. Not exactly. He looked toward the old north field. This could be an old spill. From the well. Maybe. Then why are the animals digging here? Everett didn't answer. That was becoming his favorite answer. Mara hated it. She called the county. 3 hours later, Glenn Mercer arrived. Glenn was 48, broad-shouldered, impatient, and carried himself like a man who had spent 20 years explaining obvious things to people. He inspected the enclosure, then the hole, then Mara. You have exotic carnivores digging into your property. They're temporary. They're digging toward something? That's what I'm telling you. Glenn smiled. Animals don't find oil. Mara pointed toward the hole. They found this. Glenn crouched. He scraped the soil. His expression changed. Only for a second. But Mara saw it. What? Nothing. You just changed your face. Glenn ignored her. He collected a sample. Then another. Where's the old well? Mara pointed north. Glenn looked at Everett. Everett said nothing. That silence bothered Glenn. What? Everett finally said, You should check the old records. Glenn stood. Why? Because Elias kept copies. Glenn looked at Mara. You have them? Yes. Bring them. That afternoon, Glenn returned with a state environmental technician. The old map was spread across the hood of Glenn's truck. The technician compared it with modern coordinate. Then he frowned. The well isn't where the records say it should be. Mara stepped closer. How far off? Approximately 390 feet. Everett shook his head. That's not a mistake. The technician looked at him. What makes you say that? Everett pointed toward the honey badger enclosure. Because that's where the animals are digging. Nobody laughed. The laboratory results arrived 2 days later. The soil contained petroleum hydrocarbons, but the pattern was strange. The compounds were heavily weathered. Oh, not fresh diesel. Not recent fuel. Glenn read the report twice. Something happened here a long time ago. Mara looked at the map. Could it be the abandoned well? Possibly. Then why didn't anyone know? Glenn folded the report. Someone probably did. That sentence stayed with Mara. Someone probably did. She went back through her grandfather's records. This time she found something else. A handwritten note. Northfield. Do not disturb drainage line. No explanation. No date. Just that sentence. Mara took it to Everett. He read it twice. Then he looked away. You knew. I knew there had been trouble. What kind? Water. What about it? Elias had a drainage ditch that kept smelling strange after rain. Mara stared at him. Why didn't you tell me? Because we thought it was old oil. We. Everett nodded. 3 of us. Who? Everett hesitated. Your grandfather. Me. And a man named Harold Pike. Mara knew the name. Harold Pike had owned a small drilling company nearby. He had died years earlier. What happened? Everett's eyes stayed on the map. The old well never produced. But after heavy rain, petroleum would sometimes appear near the drainage ditch. Mara looked toward the enclosure. Why did the badgers start digging now? Everett finally had an answer. Something changed. The weather had changed too. A tropical storm system moved moisture north from Texas. For the first time in months, rain was coming. Mara watched the clouds gather. Then she noticed something on the ground. A line of ants. Thousands of them. They were moving toward the same corner the honey badgers had been digging. Mara crouched. The ants were carrying insects. The insects were emerging from the soil. The honey badgers smelled them. That explained part of the behavior. But not the petroleum. The animals had likely discovered a food-rich patch, because underground moisture had brought insects closer to the surface. The petroleum odor was attracting attention for another reason. 2 clues. 1 location. 1 buried mystery. The rain arrived that night. Hard. Sudden. The desert field turned dark beneath the storm. Mara watched from the porch. Lightning flashed over the cotton. Then she saw water running toward the north boundary. The drainage ditch filled. Oil appeared on its surface. A thin rainbow sheen. Mara grabbed her boots. She ran outside. The water carried tiny black droplets toward the honey badger enclosure. The animals were awake. All 6 stood facing the ditch. They weren't digging now. They were watching. Mara followed the water upstream. It disappeared beneath a patch of grass. She moved the grass aside. There was a crack in the earth. Beneath it sat a rusted piece of metal. Mara called Everett. He arrived with a shovel. Together they cleared the soil. The metal wasn't a pipe. It was the top of an old casing. Everett stared at it. The well. Mara looked toward the dark field. But the records put it somewhere else. Everett shook his head. No. He pointed to the casing. The records were wrong. A low rumble came from beneath their feet. Mara stepped backward. Everett looked down. The ground trembled. Then stopped. They waited. Nothing. Mara whispered, "What was that?" Everett didn't answer. At dawn, the state engineer arrived. She examined the casing. Then she asked one question. How deep is this? Nobody knew. She brought in a small drilling rig. The first core sample came up brown. The second was pale. The third contained oil-stained sand. At 36 feet, the engineer stopped. She looked at Mara. This isn't just surface contamination. Mara felt her heart begin to pound. Then what is it? The engineer looked at the old casing. We need to go deeper. The drilling continued for 3 days. Mara barely left the site. The Ford 8N sat beside the field with its hood raised, forgotten for the first time since spring. Every few hours another core sample came up. Clay, sand, caliche, rock, then darker sand. The engineer, Ruth Hanley, studied each sample with the patience of someone who had learned not to trust first impressions. Ruth was 56. She had spent decades working around abandoned wells and groundwater investigations. She never guessed. She measured. She never rushed. She waited for the evidence to force the answer. At 61 feet, the samples smelled faintly of petroleum. At 74, the smell became stronger. At 83, Ruth stopped talking. She held the sample under the light. Mara watched her. What? Ruth didn't answer. She took another sample. This one was darker, grainy, oil-stained. She finally looked up. We're close to something. Mara's throat tightened. Oil. Maybe. Glenn Mercer stood behind them. Could still be contamination. Ruth nodded. That's why we're going deeper. Mara looked at the honey badgers. They were quiet. The smallest female had stopped digging entirely. She sat near the fence and watched the drill. It was almost as if the animal knew the ground had changed. That afternoon, the bank called. Mara answered. The loan officer gave her 17 days. No extension. No exception. The farm would be placed into foreclosure if the payment wasn't made. Mara hung up. She walked into the equipment shed. Her grandfather's tools still hung on the wall. Pipe wrenches, grease guns, old sockets, a broken measuring tape. She sat on an overturned bucket. For the first time, she let herself cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough for the tears to fall onto the dust between her boots. She wiped her face. Then she stood. There was still work to do. The next morning, Ruth showed Mara something on the geological cross-section. Your grandfather's land sits over a shallow structural high. What does that mean? Imagine layers of rock like blankets. Ruth drew 2 lines. Normally they're flat, but sometimes pressure bends them upward. She curved the lines. That bend can trap fluids. Oil. Potentially. So there could have been oil here the entire time? Possibly. Then why didn't the old well find it? Ruth pointed to the original drilling path. Because it was drilled too far west. Mara stared. The difference was less than 400 feet. 400 feet had separated a dry hole from something potentially valuable. Ruth continued. That's why old maps matter. People assume abandoned wells are useless because they didn't produce. Sometimes they were simply drilled in the wrong place. Mara looked at the honey badgers. The animals had been wrong about nothing. They had followed something. The people had simply misunderstood what. That afternoon, a local businessman named Calvin Reese arrived. He owned 3 ranches and had made his money in oil services. He walked around the site. Then he offered Mara $300,000 for the northern 40 acres. Mara stared at him. Why? Calvin smiled. Because I'm taking a risk. You know something. I know enough. Mara shook her head. No. His smile disappeared. You'd be debt-free. I said no. You could start over somewhere else. Mara looked across her field. My grandfather didn't give me somewhere else. Calvin left without another word. That night, Mara found Everett sitting beside the old Ford. You should sell it. She looked at him. The tractor. The farm. Mara said nothing. Everett rubbed his hands together. Sometimes keeping land means knowing when to let it go. Mara looked toward the field. I know. Then she smiled slightly. But I'm not there yet. The drilling reached 92 feet. The drill hit harder material. Ruth ordered everyone back. The bit turned. The machine groaned. Then stopped. The operator looked at her. Pressure. Ruth's face changed. She told him to shut down. They waited. A gauge moved. Barely. 1 needle width. Then stopped. Ruth watched it. Again. The pressure test began. The gauge rose. Slowly. 5 pounds. 10. 20. Mara stood beside Glenn. He whispered, "That's not groundwater." Ruth didn't answer. The pressure climbed again. 30. 40. Then dropped. Everyone exhaled. Mara looked disappointed. Ruth shook her head. Don't. What? Don't decide what it means yet. The next test lasted longer. This time the pressure held. Ruth stared at the gauge. There's a sealed formation down there. How valuable? We don't know. The company wanted a deeper test. The bank deadline was now 11 days away. Mara signed the temporary access agreement. The rig went deeper. 100 feet. 120. 140. The soil changed again. Dark sand. Then porous rock. Then something that made Ruth stop completely. She lifted the sample. Oil glistened across the grains. Not a smear. Not contamination. The rock itself carried it. Ruth looked at Mara. Now we know. Mara swallowed. What? There's a petroleum-bearing zone below your farm. The news spread before sunset. Cars appeared along the county road. People who had laughed now wanted to shake Mara's hand. Calvin returned. He offered more money. Mara still refused. The company began negotiating a proper lease. But nothing mattered yet, because the most important question remained unanswered. How large was the formation? The engineers drilled a second test point, then a third. The results were consistent. The structure continued beneath the northern field. The oil wasn't a miracle. It wasn't an ocean. But it was real. Enough to change the farm. Enough to change Mara's life. Then, during the final pressure test, something went wrong. The gauge climbed. Higher than expected. The engineer shouted for the valve. Mara stepped backward. A vibration ran through the pipe. Then came a deep metallic groan. The test line shook. A dark liquid appeared at the outlet. 1 drop. Then another. Ruth stared. Mara stepped closer. The liquid gathered in the tray. Black. Glossy. Fresh. The engineer opened the valve slightly. The pipe shuddered again. Then a thin stream of oil pushed upward. Mara looked at the ground beneath her. For months, the honey badgers had scratched at that soil. For decades, everyone had called the old well a failure. Now the earth itself seemed to be answering. The stream strengthened. Oil spilled into the containment tray. And then, behind the fence, all 6 honey badgers began digging again. Mara turned toward them. 6 animals. 6 pairs of eyes. 6 sets of claws tearing at the same earth that had nearly destroyed her farm. The smallest female dug twice. Then stopped. Mara walked toward the fence. The oil continued flowing into the containment system behind her. For the first time, she understood the whole chain. The old well had been drilled in the wrong place. Its damaged casing had allowed petroleum odors to migrate upward. Rain had changed the shallow soil. Insects had moved toward the moisture. The honey badgers had followed the insect. Their digging exposed the contaminated zone. That forced an investigation. The investigation uncovered the geological structure. And the deeper drilling found the oil. No miracle. No animal with supernatural powers. Just nature leaving clues. And one young farmer stubborn enough to keep looking. The first payment from the mineral lease arrived 11 days later. It was enough to stop the foreclosure. Mara paid the bank, then the electricity company, then the irrigation contractor. She didn't buy a new truck. She didn't buy a mansion. She bought something much less exciting. A new pump. The old one had been failing for 3 summers. The new system cut water waste and gave her better control over the cotton. The farm began recovering. The oil operation stayed concentrated on the northern edge. Mara negotiated strict limits on heavy traffic through her field. She protected the irrigation lines. She insisted that the company restore disturbed ground after construction. Some people told her she was being difficult. Mara didn't care. She had learned that surviving a farm wasn't only about earning money. It was about deciding what the money was supposed to protect. The honey badgers remained on the property for another 14 months. Their enclosure was rebuilt. The drainage was improved. The original digging site was secured. A wildlife specialist eventually found them a permanent facility with a larger naturalistic habitat. Mara hated the day they left. She stood beside the trailer as the smallest female disappeared inside. The animal turned once. Their eyes met through the opening. Mara smiled. "Keep digging." The door closed. The trailer drove away. The farm became quiet again. Too quiet. 3 months later, Glenn Mercer came to the property carrying a folder. He handed it to Mara. "What is this?" "The amended inspection report." She opened it. At the bottom, Glenn had written a note. "I should have listened the first time." Mara looked at him. "You laughed." "I did. You said animals don't find oil." "I was wrong." She smiled. "You were." Glenn laughed. "That's the part one was afraid you'd remember." Mara closed the folder. "I'll remember both." 5 years passed. The farm changed slowly. The cotton returned. Mara planted pecans along the western edge. She added a small greenhouse. The old Ford 8N still pulled equipment around the property. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't comfortable. But every time it started, Mara thought of her grandfather. The machine had been built before she was born. It had survived drought, bad harvest, 2 owners, 1 near foreclosure, and an oil discovery. She refused to let it become decoration. Everett came by every Thursday. He stopped repairing equipment years earlier, but he still had opinions about everything. Ruth visited once each spring. Glenn became the county official Mara called when paperwork became impossible. And Calvin Reese? He eventually apologized. Not publicly. Just once. He found Mara beside the orchard and said, "You were right to keep it." Mara didn't ask whether he meant the farm or the oil. She already knew. 10 years after the first digging began, Mara walked the northern field at sunrise. The old well site was covered. The production equipment stood farther away. The original hole where the honey badgers had dug had been preserved behind a low fence. Wild grass grew around it. A small sign explained the history. It mentioned the abandoned 1972 well, the damaged casing, the geological structure, the later discovery. At the bottom, Mara had insisted on one final sentence. 6 rescued honey badgers first drew attention to the site. Visitors laughed when they read it. Mara didn't. She knew how close everyone had come to missing the clue. That was the lesson she carried with her. Land rarely announces its secret. It whispers. A yellow leaf before drought. A wet patch where the soil should be dry. A bird suddenly abandoning one tree. Roots growing around something buried. An old pump making a different sound. A strange smell after rain. A stubborn animal refusing to leave one particular place. Most people see inconvenience. Farmers who survive long enough learn to see information. Mara learned it at 22. She learned it because she couldn't afford not to. One spring morning, 12 years after the discovery, a storm crossed Lea County. Rain fell for 40 minutes. When the clouds cleared, Mara walked toward the north field. The desert smelled different. Clean. Wet. Alive. She passed the old site. A tiny shimmer appeared in a shallow puddle. Mara stopped. She crouched. For 1 second, she wondered whether the story was beginning again. Then she noticed a tractor leaking hydraulic fluid near the fence. She laughed. Nice try. She stood. The sun came over the horizon. Behind her, the Ford 8N waited beside the shed. Mara climbed into the seat. The engine coughed once. She pulled the choke. The engine coughed again. She waited. Then turned the key. On the third crank, the old tractor started. Mara eased it toward the orchard. The tires rolled over ground that had once seemed worthless. Ground the bank wanted. Ground the oil company wanted. Ground that 6 stubborn animals had once torn apart. But Mara still saw what her grandfather had seen. A farm. Nothing more. Nothing less. And as the tractor moved through the morning mist, sunlight touched the cotton leaves one row at a time. The fields brightened. The old machinery rattled softly. A hawk circled above the northern boundary. And beneath the quiet soil, the land kept its secrets. For another morning, Mara let it. If Mara's story reminded you of someone in your own family, tell me about them below. Maybe your grandfather kept an old tractor everyone told him to sell. Maybe your family farm survived a drought, a flood, a bad harvest, or one impossible year. Or maybe there was something on your land that everyone ignored until one person finally stopped and paid attention. Those stories matter because American farming history isn't only written in newspapers. Sometimes it's written in muddy boots, rusty machines, worn fences, and quiet decisions nobody else understood. Share your story with us, and stay with the channel, because the next forgotten farm has a mystery buried somewhere nobody thought to look.